Thank you, Father Gabriel, for joining me to do a little bit of an interview. So, for people who don't know you, please introduce yourself. And for those who are also unfamiliar with monastic life, what is monasticism? What does it mean to be a monk?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me today. It's a joy to be here with you. My name is Father Gabriel. I'm from Holy Cross Monastery in West Virginia. Holy Cross has been in West Virginia since 2000. It was founded originally in 1986 in Missouri, outside of St. Louis. So the monastery sort of started its growth there, but the property was very limited. St. Louis was expanding, and if I remember right, the city was planning to build a road right through the dining hall. So for various reasons, the monastery growing, the city growing, it didn't seem like it was the best place for the monastery to be. So in 2000, a pious couple, Mo and Nadia Sill, who lived here on this property, actually donated the property to us. He was a professor, at Marshall University. She was the daughter of a priest from, I think, California, I believe. They were very close to the church, and they both felt very strongly about trying to bring orthodoxy to the area. And of course, in our Orthodox tradition, it might sound strange, to people who aren't familiar with the concept. But really, monasticism has always been one of the main missionary vehicles of the church throughout the 2,000-year history of the Orthodox Church. You can see this, in many different times and places, but especially in Russia. Really, if you look at the Christianization of Russia, very often what would happen is monks would go out into the wilderness to be alone, to be secluded, to be able to pray and repent and be with God. But the people would get curious and want to go and see what was going on out there, and they would meet these monks, these holy people, and they would become so attracted by the beauty of the Orthodox way of life that they would move out there, and whole villages would really form around these monasteries. And so this is quite a common phenomenon in Russia and Eastern Europe. And like I said, it's a bit foreign maybe to the American mindset, the Protestant mindset, who think of well, monks, what are they really doing for the church? What are they doing for other people? They're just off doing their own thing. But really, in the Orthodox, in the lived experience of the Orthodox Church, that's really not the case at all. So Mo and Nadia knew this. They really thought that bringing monasticism, especially English speaking monasticism, to this area was very important, so much so they were willing to give us their homes, to donate this property for us to build the monastery here. So we are, as I just mentioned, an English-speaking monastery. We're part of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, but all of us are Americans. The vast majority of us are converts to the Orthodox faith. And almost everything here is in English. We all, the day-to-day life here is in English. The services are almost entirely in English. We'll do a little bit of Slavonic if we have some Russian visitors, just to try to make them feel at home a bit. But really, this is the vision that the founders of this monastery have had is really to bring sort of the ancient, timeless experience of Orthodox monasticism to America, to American people in the English language. So on the one hand, we value our heritage very much, but we also value the fact that we're Americans and that we're here in the midst of other Americans very much. And we feel that that's a very sort of unique ministry that we have to the church. Monasticism is very ancient and a very important part of the Orthodox Church, but here in America, it's still very young, very small. If people don't speak English, if people only speak English, if they don't speak one of the old world languages, there's only really a few monasteries that they can go to and experience things in a way that they can understand. As far as I know, we're one of, if not the largest English-speaking men's monastery in the world. That goes to show you how small English-speaking monasticism is. I think there's about 27 of us. So, we have nothing compared to the hundreds or thousands, that some monasteries in Greece or Russia might have. But God has been very kind to us, bringing us here, bringing us together with one another. I myself came here in 2010. So I converted to Orthodoxy in Raleigh, North Carolina at an Antiochian church there, All Saints, in I believe 2000, I forget if it was 2006 or 2007. it was during my my college years, and so I found out about Orthodoxy. I was not a Christian at the time, but I thought I knew all about Christianity, but I encountered Orthodoxy, and it was this whole completely different world, this whole completely different understanding of what the Christian faith really meant. And so, almost as soon as I encountered Orthodoxy, I heard about monasticism, that it wasn't just something that medieval monks did 500 years ago, 700 years ago, but it was still something that was a living part of the church today. And so very soon after I became Orthodox, I began to visit here at Holy Cross and visit a few other monasteries. And, I just felt really this sense. I mean, I had a lot of good reasons ultimately, but I felt a sense that I couldn't on the deepest level explain that if I was really going to be serious about my faith, that this was what God was calling me to do. So I moved here in 2010. I was ordained to the priesthood in 2014. So I've been a priest now for about 10 years. There's really, I don't think, that much more to say about me personally. Monks usually don't like to talk about themselves too much. I'm happy to share something that you might feel the viewers would be benefited by, but I don't want to just, launch into soliloquy about my own life.
Sure.
But hopefully that's a little bit of an introduction to myself and to the monastery. I guess about the question of monasticism in general. I mentioned, of course, the aspect in which we're missionaries and have been missionaries, throughout much of the history of the church. As far as what monasticism really is, it's a hard thing to put into words, but I would say, probably the best way to explain it briefly is to talk about really the founder of Cenobitic monasticism, who was St. Anthony the Great. And the famous story from his life, 3rd, 4th century, is that he was in church one day and he heard the gospel reading of the rich young man who asked, the Lord, what do I need to do to be saved? And of course he said, the commandments. And he said, well, I've kept the commandments, what do I still lack? And Christ said, if you would be perfect, go sell all that you have, give to the poor, and come and follow me. And so when St. Anthony heard this, he just immediately did so. He left the church, he sold everything that he had, and he went to the desert in order to leave behind all the things that were distractions from the one thing needful, really. So, I would say really, it's not that monasticism is some kind of different Christianity or different life. It's the Christian life. It's simply the attempt to live that life with as few distractions as possible, with as few unnecessary things in life that would and it's not that anything else other than monasticism is somehow bad or evil. Of course, marriage is blessed. St. Paul is very, very clear about that. The parish life that we have in the Orthodox Church is wonderful. It's not that monasticism is somehow the only real thing or the best thing or the highest thing. Another example or rather metaphor that I heard early on that was very helpful for me personally in coming to understand what monasticism really was that, if the church is a hospital, this is, of course, for us Orthodox Christians, a common metaphor. St. John Chrysostom said, that the church isn't a courtroom for souls, it's a hospital for souls. So if the church is a hospital, then, when we talk about, parish life versus monastery life, the saying is that the parishes are the outpatient clinics and the monasteries are the ICUs. Some people are able to be healthy, normal Christian people, going to the outpatient clinic a few times a week, for example, going to church on Sundays, maybe a few weekdays. But those of us who are really sick, those of us who really need a lot of help to struggle with our passions, and we need all the tools that we can get in order to keep ourselves focused on Christ above all else. We need to go to the ICU, to the monastery. We need to be enmeshed in the healing atmosphere of the church 24/7, basically. So again, it's really hard to get to the essence of what monasticism is, but these are a few, ways, I guess, of introducing it. That basically what we do here, day in, day out, is simply try to follow the gospel commandments as thoroughly as we can. And of course, we fail all the time. We're very sinful people. None of us are by any means the spiritual giants that you read about when you read about some of the monastic saints. But at the same time, if you can say anything good about us, it's really that at least all of us share the same goal, the same ideal, that even though we do it very imperfectly, we're trying to put Christ above everything else each moment of the day. We're trying to put the spiritual life above anything else, and we're trying to put one another above ourselves each moment of the day. And so again, even though we fail at that constantly, still it's that's the effort that we're trying to make.
Okay. So I think maybe to kind of make it a little more concrete for people, maybe talk about what you do at Holy Cross, or what a day in the life of a monk looks like.
So I'll say first of all that in Orthodoxy, it's different. It's a different situation than, for example, in the Catholic Church, where the Catholic Church has these different orders of monasticism. You have the Benedictines, you have the Trappists, the Cistercians, and really you kind of know what to expect. If you go to a Trappist monastery, it's going to be essentially the same kind of life, at least, as at a different Trappist monastery. In Orthodoxy, each monastery is really unique. It's like its own unique person. So there are of course things that are going to be common. There are things that are going to be fairly universal, but at the same time, each monastery has its own particular ministry, its own particular expression of how they live out those kind of monastic ideals, or try to the best of their ability. So I can tell you what a day at Holy Cross is like. That's not necessarily going to be the same as the day-to-day life at really any other Orthodox monastery will necessarily be, even though there's going to obviously be high-level similarities. Of course, church is always important. Obedience is important, prayer is important, but how that's expressed in a day-to-day life, it's really going to be different at each place that you go to. But here at Holy Cross, we are a Cenobitic monastery, which is really a Greek word for meaning monks who do everything together in common. There's kind of the more eremitic tradition, which is like hermits, where people are really seeking monasticism in a very individual way, a solitary way. But the kind of monasticism we have here is really based on community life. Both are important, both are good, but the Holy Fathers say that the communal life is much safer, especially for beginners. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Maybe we can get into that later. But anyway, I wanted to sort of introduce the concept of doing everything together as being very important for the kind of monasticism that we have. So each day, the day begins formally at 5 o'clock in the morning. We have matins and liturgy together in church. That lasts until around 8 o'clock, give or take, depending on what the feast is that day, what kind of service it is that day. But we start with matins and liturgy, and that's something that's very important to us, that we begin the day not only together, praying before God, worshiping together in God, but also with the opportunity to receive Holy Communion every day. That's really a tremendous blessing that very few people have, and not that every monk necessarily does receive communion each day. Everyone has their own sort of spiritual discipline that they work out with their spiritual father, what's best for them. But at least, even to be in the presence of the mystical sacrifice every day, and to be transported really to the worship of heaven, as the foundation of each day, the beginning of each day, is very important. So after that, from about 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock, there's free time. Some people will go back and do some spiritual reading, maybe say some of their prayer rule. Maybe they had gotten up earlier before the morning services to pray, and so they'll take a little nap or something like that. But at any rate, at 9 o'clock, from about 9 to noon, is the morning work period. So something that St. Benedict, one of the Western monastic fathers, said, the Latin phrase is ora et labora, which means work and prayer. And really, these are the two things that monks have to hold together. It's of course, it's understood that it's very important to pray as monks, but it's also extremely important to work, preferably with our hands. This is something that is really, again, maybe surprising to people. People might have the idea, monks, they just go and they pray all day long, or they read spiritual books all day long or something. And then, they show up here and become a novice, and they're told to, scrub the toilets or go, muck out the barn or something like that. And they're like, this isn't the spiritual life. This isn't what I signed up for. But really, it's it's important not only on the practical sense that, of course, there's 27 people here. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to keep the monastery going, in order to provide financially for the Brotherhood to continue, in order to serve the pilgrims and visitors who come here. But on a spiritual level, to learn that, that whatever we're doing, whatever kind of work that we're doing all day long, even if it is something as seemingly mundane as scrubbing a toilet, or packing up boxes in the shipping room, whatever it is, that this is also a form of prayer. This is also part of our spiritual life, that this is an offering that we're making to God, to our brothers, to the visitors, that we're giving God our small labors, and in return, he's using it to create this holy place where, people can come and get away from the world for a few days to really immerse themselves in the church for a few days. The prayers that we're offering, of course, for the world are important, but also this, this physical service. And so on a practical level, that can, again, take many forms. Obviously, people need to cook, people need to clean, we need to work on maintaining the buildings, we need to work on building new buildings. We are a growing monastery, and we always have some construction project or another going. As far as financial support, the main thing that we do to support ourselves is to make incense for churches as well as for individuals. We also make candles. We make various baked goods, soaps, different things like that that we'll sell in our store or online. The clergy spend a good portion of their days spiritually counseling either the Brotherhood or the visitors. We have a farm. We have a bunch of chickens, so there's outdoor work to do. We keep very, very busy. People often might think that it's very boring to be a monk. When in reality, I was bored far more often as a layperson than I ever have been as a monk. There's always plenty to do here. The morning work period is 9 to noon. At noon, we gather in church again together for a short prayer service to our patron saint for the sick and the suffering. And right after that, we all have lunch together. In the monastery, we have, at least in our monastery, we have 2 formal meals a day, lunch and supper. For breakfast, there's sort of just a small buffet that people can go to optionally in between the morning services and the beginning of the work period. But the formal meals are lunch and supper. And something that's very distinctive about monastic practice is we keep silence during these meals, and we listen to someone read from either the life of the saint of the day or some other spiritually profitable book, so that at the same time that we're feeding our bodies, we're also feeding our souls. So that, again, it's a big transition from what we're used to in the world. And I think sometimes people might think, well, how do you really have the chance to get close to each other if you don't speak during meals, if you don't take that time to converse with one another? But in reality, our experience is really that it really strengthens our spiritual bonds with one another quite a bit, that we're, of course, gathered together, eating together, but we're also with God. We're also communing with God at the same time that we're feeding our bodies, and that over time, that kind of spiritual connection that we have with one another, even if it's unspoken, is really extremely powerful. So anyway, sorry for that tangent. After lunch, there's another hour or so of free time. 1:30 to 4:30 is the second work period of the day, the afternoon work period. And then afterward, we clean up. At 5 o'clock, we gather again in church for Vespers. Right after Vespers is supper, and then right after supper is Compline. So that'll end sometime between 6 and 6:30. From then until 9 at night is again some unstructured free time that people use in different ways. And then from 9 in the evening to 9 in the morning, we keep total silence. So during 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., we have a blessing to speak. Again, the whole issue of silence and how much to converse with one another, how much to converse with pilgrims, is something that will vary quite a bit from monastery to monastery. But one of our vocations, at Holy Cross, is really hospitality, to offer the ability for pilgrims, lay people, visitors to come and share our life with us. We always have many visitors each day of the year now. It wasn't that way when I first came. When I first started visiting in 2008, there were maybe a few visitors that would come each month. But now, as I said, we really almost always have 5, 10, 15 people with us constantly. So that's something that we didn't necessarily decide to do, but rather I think God called us to do it. So partially for that reason, we do tend to speak with one another and with visitors more than some other monasteries might. Also, our abbot feels that as Americans, we need to be aware of sort of the strengths that we have, but also the weaknesses that we have. And really, as Americans, we're not cut out for that kind of really austere, silent life that maybe some of the ancient fathers lived. Most of us would probably just have some kind of nervous breakdown or something like that. So, of course, we got to try to keep a balance, and find the middle path in everything. And so here, that's how we try to do it. Half the day we speak, half the day we don't speak. That's the kind of balance that we go for as far as that goes. So, looking at it all kind of holistically, we spend, about 6 hours or so a day working, spend about 4 to 5 hours a day, depending, in prayer and church together. Each person has their own, private prayer role and cell role that, it's different for each monk. But those are sort of the three main areas of a monk's life. There's private prayer, there's corporate prayer, and then there's the work, the labor that we do for the sake of the monastery. So if you have any questions about any of that, please feel free to ask. But that's sort of the bird's eye view of what a normal day is here.
Okay. So you mentioned you guys kind of support yourself through the work that you do on a day-to-day basis. I visited Holy Cross a little over a year ago, and it was the first time I had visited a monastery. So it was a really good experience, and it was it wasn't too austere. I also have been to Mount Athos, so that was quite the difference.
World for sure.
Yeah. So I highly recommend it for anyone who's anywhere within the radius of Wayne, West Virginia, to come check out Holy Cross. But you guys do book pretty far in advance, so definitely plan ahead.
We are, we're hoping to expand our guest facilities. As I said, for many years of our existence, we weren't used to getting hardly any guests at all. So we do have limited accommodations. We try to make room for everybody that we possibly can. But if you do want to come, definitely the furthest out in advance you can reach out and try to arrange a time, the better. God willing, as we're able to get some of these buildings built, that it'll become less difficult to try to get a reservation in with us. But at least for right now, if you can let us know at least a few months in advance, just to make sure that the time that you want is going to be available.
Gotcha. So on the topic of, you guys have a lot of building projects and you're supporting yourselves through your work. Where can people go to donate, and what are some of the current projects that you guys are doing currently?
So the most important thing by far right now is we're building a new church. As I mentioned earlier, the monastery moved to West Virginia in 2000. At that time, there were 8 people in the brotherhood. And so the church, which was the first thing, of course, that we built when we got to the property, was really designed for a brotherhood of 8 people who had almost no visitors. We've expanded that building a little bit, but there's only so much physical space that we could use to expand that. And so the current church that we have is getting quite cramped, especially when there's a lot of visitors for a feast day or when there's visiting clergy. The altar is extremely small, and for a brotherhood now of, as I said, I think around 27. We've limited the brotherhood to that number for, I think, almost 10 years now, because the thought was that if we don't have room in the church, and also if we don't have room in the dining hall for more brothers than we have now, it doesn't make any more sense to build more dormitories to accept more brothers until we can build a larger church that's really suited for the kind of numbers even that we have now, much less that we might have once we do build more monastic dormitory space and more guest houses. So by God's grace, we're getting very close to being done with that. It's been a long project. There have been a lot of temptations. I'm sure if you ask almost anyone who's gone through a church building project, they'll be able to tell you from their own experience that the devil hates when churches are being built. That's absolutely true. The devil also hates monasteries. And so I guess when you're a monastery and you're building a church, you really get attacked. We've had a lot of temptations, but God's brought us through everything. We're getting quite close now to being able to move into the new church. Hopefully this coming year, if God wills. But we do still need some help to get moved into it, especially to get things like the iconostas built, to be able to outfit the dining hall with the kitchen equipment and the tables and chairs that we'll need. So if you're interested in learning more about that project and in helping out, you can go to our website at holycross.org. There's some videos describing the project. There's a web page that describes the new church in detail. There's construction photos, but to summarize, we've built it to be able to comfortably accommodate a brotherhood of 50, as well as about 100 to 125 more visitors. So we're not anticipating on having that many visitors daily, but for the big feasts that we do have, the Exaltation of the Cross, St. Pantaleon's Day, who's our patron saint, we do get hundreds of people for those feast days, and so we want to be able to accommodate them as well. So again, we're getting very close to that, thank God. Once that new church is able to be moved into, then it's our plan to immediately afterward start on a new dormitory project to be able to bring in more brothers, because again, we've been about the size that we are, which is 27 or so people for pretty close to 10 years now. And of course, with all the young men coming into Orthodoxy, we have a lot of people come who are interested in the monastic life, but we simply don't have the room to accept them. So our abbot, Father Seraphim, feels very, very strongly that this new church building is his legacy to the brotherhood, but also to the church in America in general, for him to leave behind this place where, again, not only can monastics come and try to work out their salvation, but the increasing number of families, of pilgrims who want to come here. And the world around us is becoming so hostile towards the spiritual life in so many different ways that even though I think it's always been important, I think it's even more important now than ever for there to be these places of spiritual refuge where people can go, for a weekend or a week, once a year or once every couple of years, whatever your schedule allows, but to really just get away from all of these distractions, all of this tumult, all of this noise that's basically pulling us away from Christ, trying to distract us with this thing or that thing that ultimately isn't going to last into eternity, and be able to just spend a few days here peacefully, being immersed in the church 24/7. It's an extremely valuable and important experience, I think, that will really, I'm sure, especially having been to Athos, you've experienced this, that even after you leave and come back, you look at the world in a different way, you look at your life in a different way, and you're able, hopefully, to retain some of that grace of having been in a holy place. And of course, we're nothing on the level of Mount Athos, but at the same time, I've seen so much grace being given to the people who come here, not because we're anything, but because this is a place dedicated to God. This is a place where Saint Pantaleon, our patron saint, is very close to us, and we've seen him, with our own eyes, work many miracles for the people who have come here suffering either in soul or in body. And it's such a blessing for us to be able to be a small part of that work that God's doing for the church here in America. But of course, for that to happen, there needs to be a physical place for that to happen. So
Right.
to build this new church, to build ultimately more space for monastics and for visitors, this is important, I think, for the church in America. There's a saying from ancient times that really monasticism is the spiritual barometer of the church. That if monasticism is healthy, that means that the church is healthy. But if monasticism isn't healthy, that means that the church isn't healthy. And again, it's not because monasticism is something different than the church, or that that monasticism is somehow the essential part of Christianity, but simply it's to say that in any time in which the church is spiritually healthy, you'll be able to see all the different vocations of Christian life not only being lived out, but supporting one another, helping one another, interacting with one another. It's very important for us as monks to see lay people, and especially families, come, to be able to see, healthy, Christian families come and participate in the prayer life together with us. It's a tremendous consolation, and it reminds us that really for Orthodox Christians, distance is not any kind of barrier, that our union with one another is in Christ, and that, whether, we're a monk here, praying and laboring and trying to repent of our sins, or if we're married with kids, living in the middle of a huge bustling city, that, not only are we living the same spiritual life, but we all need one another to be living that spiritual life together, praying for each other, helping one another, inspiring one another, showing each other these different manifestations of what Christian love really means. So we invite all of you, of course, to come if you're able to, and participate in that with us here, but also to please remember us in your prayers, in your churches, in your homes, as we are praying for you all here at the monastery. This kind of Christian unity is especially important in the kind of really fragmented, disassociated world that we're living in now, where there's so much division and hostility and enmity. I think really to focus on the only source of real unity there can possibly be, which is our life in Christ, is something that's so important for all of us.
You mentioned earlier, a lot of young people coming to the church.
Mm-hmm.
I think one logical question for many people who have come to the church is like, okay, what now? Now that I've become Orthodox. So what would be your advice to newly illumined Orthodox Christians?
Well, I'll say, first of all, that I have to sort of give the cop-out answer to this, which as an Orthodox priest talking on the internet, I pretty much have to give before I give any advice whatsoever, which is talk to your spiritual father about it. I can tell you generally, sort of the counsel of the church about things, but each person has their own life, their own circumstances, their own strengths and weaknesses, and really only your spiritual father, only your father confessor is going to be able to give you, the best advice about how to apply these sort of timeless principles of the Christian life to our own specific lives. So, with that said, at the beginning, I would say, the first thing to do is just live the normal Christian life. Don't be too focused on immediately trying to find, what your own ultimate vocation might be. We all, no matter what it is that God ultimately wants us to do for the church, whether that's, to be a father, a wife, a priest, a monk, a teacher, whatever it might be, the foundation for anything, any of our labors, any of our efforts, if it's going to bear any fruit whatsoever, the foundation of it has to be prayer. It has to be, a real serious life of prayer. And so I think laying that foundation, first of all, before trying to jump in and do something, if, I forget, what the saying is, but basically, you can't give away what you don't have. So if we don't have a genuine spiritual life ourselves, our ability to help anyone else is likewise going to be extremely limited, because it's ultimately going to just come from ourselves rather than from the grace of God. Our job as Christians is really to get out of the way of the Holy Spirit, so that it can be, like St. Paul says, no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. But that takes work. That's what ascetic effort is all about. That's what the life of prayer is all about, is trying to develop that inner union, that inner life of prayer that will allow the grace of God to come and not only bless, but fill all of the efforts that we make beyond that. So, I would say go to as many of the church services as you're able to. Talk to your spiritual father about what the right prayer role is, and be faithful to that every single day. I think, it can be tempting, especially for new converts, to feel like, quantity is the most important thing, that I should be praying a lot. I should have these long prayer rules and say all these long prayers. And that's what, sort of a spiritual life looks like. But almost inevitably that will lead to people just burning out. And then, you pray for 3 hours one day, and then you don't even open the prayer book for a week after that, because, or you get so discouraged that you can't sustain, that kind of intense spiritual effort, that you just give it up, So, personally, my advice and my experience has been having a reasonable spiritual discipline that you do faithfully every single day will lead to much, much more progress than just trying to bite off some huge prayer rule because you read, in the sayings of the Desert Fathers that so-and-so did, 250 prayer ropes every single day. And that's how you become a saint or something like that. One of the metaphors that, in fact, the Desert Fathers used is, that our heart is really like a stone, and if you have a big, stony heart and you just pour a few huge buckets of water on it, the stone's really not going to be changed at all. It's still going to be, the same way that it was before. But if you drip a little bit of water on that rock every single day, over time, it's going to be worn down. That stone will be broken up, and that living, true heart will be able to emerge. So, I would say, quality and consistency of prayer and of spiritual effort is much more important than quantity. But again, talk to your spiritual father about this. The other thing that I would say is, again, using the, sort of the analogy of the monastic life, because again, it's not like the monastic life is a different kind of Christianity or a different kind of spiritual life. It's the same kind of spiritual life. So just as here at the monastery, we have our private prayers that we do in our cells, we have the corporate prayers that we do together in church, and then we have our work. I also think it's important that we should find ways to work for the church, And again, this isn't to jump into some, huge career, or high, spiritual vocation. It's simply, going to your priest and saying, hey, I have a few hours on Sunday. Is there something that I can do around the church to lend a hand? Or is there's something that I can do? Can I help set up coffee hour? Whatever it is, find some small, humble way to contribute to what your church actually needs, because, it's very easy for us to sort of have these, lofty romantic ideas if I can do this for the church or that for the church. And it somehow becomes more about an image that we have of ourselves than it becomes about actually trying to meet the needs that exist right in front of us in the real world. And of course, that's not limited to the church, in its, sort of visible capacity as an institution. It's also about helping the brothers and sisters that we see around us in the parish or that we see around us at work, that we see around us and our neighbors. I think the process of trying to learn to see Christ in the people that God arranges for us to meet every single day is extremely important. And so I would say, and again, I'm not trying to give people rules, talk to your spiritual father about this, but one thing that I've found to be a very beneficial practice is, each day try to do at least one thing for somebody else for no other reason than that they need it, and that can be, it doesn't have to be, giving your money to somebody on the street or, or even performing some task for someone who needs help with something. It can be saying a kind word to somebody who looks like they're having a hard time, or saying a prayer for somebody who, it seems like there's nobody to pray for them. I don't want to, it can be easy to spiritualize it too much as sort of a substitute for real action. So you have to find a balance. And again, this is where a spiritual father will be able to help us to do that. But finding some way to serve humbly the real practical needs of the people that God has put into our lives, I think that is very important as well. So those are a few sort of the basic pieces of advice that I would give. Every church is different. Every spiritual father is different. Every person is different. But I do remember that when I first converted, that the advice that my priest gave me, the advice that, and I think this came from the diocese, if I remember right, but basically for the first 3 years, don't try to pursue any formal vocation in the church, whether that's vocation, monasticism, whatever. For the first 3 years, just live as an Orthodox Christian, that'll give you a foundation. It'll also give you an opportunity, I think, to actually hear the calling of God, not just in the sense of what I gravitate towards, or what appeals to me when I think about it abstractly, but to see in our day-to-day lives, what doors is God opening? What doors is he not opening? It can be very tempting, I think, especially for us, young Americans to, try to make all these decisions in the abstract. I remember when I was going through the process of trying to decide whether to enter the monastery or not. At the time I was living in Wilmington, and in the parish there was another young man who was in a similar situation to me. He was telling me he had gone around and talked to different abbots and different people to ask for their advice on how to know, what does God want me to do in my life? And in this particular case, the question was to get married or to become a monk. And he said, finally, one abbot told him, look, you don't decide to become a monk in the abstract any more than you decide to get married in the abstract. You decide to marry a person. Same thing, you decide to enter a specific monastery. So you don't just, sit in your room one day and then all of a sudden say, okay, well, I'm going to go become a monk. That's not how it works. You have to have a relationship with the monastery. You have to, petition to a specific abbot to enter a specific community. And of course, you do that, almost all the time after you've gotten to know that community over an extended period of time. So I do think that it's good if you feel like maybe you have a monastic calling to visit a monastery early on, but that's because I think it's a good idea for everybody to visit a monastery early on. It's going to be a beneficial experience for us no matter what God is ultimately calling us to. So if you do, I would say don't make it about a vocation. Just make it about, I'm going to go spend a few days in a spiritual place praying for a few days. Don't, like Chris said, let tomorrow take thought for the things of itself. Just do what I need to do for my spiritual life today. And again, organically, I think in many cases, that will lead to God's will being made more manifest. If you find after a few years that you're really living for that few days at the monastery, and you can't wait to get there again after you leave, well, that's a pretty good indication that maybe you do have a calling to the monastic life, But just sitting in your room and thinking about, well, should I become a monk or not? Like, that's not really going to help you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That's good advice, especially for a lot of people who are just starting out. Like, just go to church, just do the everyday life for a little bit, and then later we can talk about vocation. I think that's good, sober advice. So inevitably, at some point, that question does come up. Okay, what is my vocation? What do I do? We all have a place in the divine economy of God. So how do we figure out where that is? And it's not always immediately obvious to us. And from my understanding, the church, broadly speaking, kind of blesses two ways of life. There's marriage, and then there's monasticism. So do you have any advice for people trying to discern that path if they're kind of in that position where they're like, I could go either way? How should people go about discerning that?
That's a great question. I'd answer it to begin with, with the same sort of disclaimer of talk to your spiritual father about this, because really we cannot make these decisions on our own. We really need the advice and perhaps also of other trusted, spiritual people who know us, whose lives we admire. We can also ask their opinion about these things, but of course, mainly our spiritual father. But with that said, as far as these two paths, you're right about that. There's also another saying, which is that there are three paths towards sanctity in the Orthodox Church. There's marriage, monasticism, and martyrdom. Of course, martyrdom in its formal sense isn't something that most of us are necessarily in imminent encounter with. But at the same time, and I forget who said this, but I think it's quite true. If you take that saying, that there's those three paths, marriage, monasticism, and martyrdom, that ultimately there's only one path, and that's martyrdom. And that really marriage and monasticism are both merely different forms of martyrdom. And I think this is a very important way for us to look at our lives. And first of all, let me back up a little bit and say, okay, well, maybe that sounds a little bit morbid, but we have to remember that the word martyrdom, what it means is witness. That the martyrs, were not primarily defined by the fact that they died. They were primarily defined by the fact that they witnessed to their faith, to the power of their faith, the meaning of their faith, the depth of their love for God, in such a way that they showed that nothing else in the world meant anything compared to that. That was the witness that they made. That was what made them holy. I mean, just dying doesn't make you holy, and so that. But of course, with that said, it's impossible to make a true Christian witness without sacrifice, because Christ's sacrifice on the cross was the ultimate revelation of who He is. And so, if we truly believe in theosis and deification and union with Christ, that really to be completely united with Christ and to be again, no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me, this will inevitably result in a life characterized by sacrificial love, because that's who God is. That's who Christ is. That's what holiness is. But so we need to look at whatever specific vocation, calling, future that we may have in that light, of not just, what's going to fulfill me, what's going to make me happy, what's going to make the best use of my talents and abilities. Of course, I'm not saying don't ask those questions at all, but none of those are really the ultimate criteria. The ultimate criteria is what is going to bring me into the closest union with Christ possible. So, when people here at the monastery are novices, so, for those of you who may not be familiar, there's different stages of the monastic life. And really, for most people, they're not going to take their final vows to be a monk forever until usually at least 6 or 7 years after they first come to the monastery. But the first stage in that sort of progression towards making your vows, your permanent vows as a monk, is what's called the novitiate, where you're, and again, canonically and typically, this lasts for 3 years, but different monasteries do it a little bit differently. In any case, those first 3 years when you're a novice, you've made no formal commitment, you've made no vows, you're living the monastic life as fully as possible, but you're in this period of discerning, is this what God's calling me to or not? It's a period of testing and of discernment and of getting to know what is this life really like day in and day out. And so, far from being forbidden, it's encouraged for novices to consider, should I stay or not? And so for me, when a novice comes to me and asks, it's a difficult thing to discern because, of course, there's always going to be temptations to go back to the world. Even if someone has a true and sincere monastic vocation, of course, the demons are going to fight against this. They're going to try and whisper this reason and that reason to give it up, and to abandon it. And it can be very confusing because they can oftentimes tell half truths. They can say things that, sound very pious, even. Like, for example, this is a common temptation that I've also encountered personally, speaking to novices, this thought of, okay, I've been taught so many things about the spiritual life here at the monastery. I should go out and share these, with other people. I should share these riches of the faith that I've learned about here with people who've never heard about it, because these things are so beautiful and meaningful. I need to share these with others, So again, it sounds very pious, but it's also very easy for this to merely be a cloak for our pride of, I've become a spiritual person now. Now I can go and really show other people, how the spiritual life is really supposed to be lived. So it's tricky. So, but basically, what I tell them first and foremost when they're considering, should I stay at the monastery or should I go back to the world? All these other concerns, thoughts, ideas, reasons, motivations, lay all of them aside at first and simply ask, do I want to go back to the world because I sincerely believe that that's where I will find Christ, or not? If there's some other motivation, whatever other motivation, no matter how good it might be in and of itself, if the primary reason isn't to seek Christ, then it's probably a temptation. It's probably a distraction. We need to have, again, to go back to the parable of the rich young man, and this is for everybody, not just for monks, the question we should always be asking is, how can I be saved? Not just how can I be saved, but, how can I become perfect? What does Christ say? Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Of course, we all fall extremely short of this ideal, and it's not about, some sort of legalism or some sort of, guilt trip, if we have any kind of failure. But the point is, we should all be striving more than anything else in our lives to be with Christ, to be with God. And all the decisions that we make about how to live our lives should be based in, in this framework of what's going to help me to be with God. So if if at the monastery, and, again, not everyone is supposed to be a monk. Sometimes people come here and they just get so, weighed down with the, with the asceticism or whatever else it might be, that it ends up separating them from God. And that's not good. That's a pretty good sign that you don't have a monastic vocation. Our abbot will sometimes say that, none of us could live this life even for a day if the grace of God wasn't there helping us to do it. But really, that's true. That's true of any life. That's true of the Christian life in general. It's very, very difficult, of course. It's also very joyous, but it can only be done with God's grace. And so if God manifestly isn't giving us the grace to do something, then again, that's a good consideration that maybe it's because he wants us to do something else, But so to get back to the martyrdom specifically, as an example, or rather as a framework for making the decisions about monasticism or marriage, I really, and I'm a monk. I have never been married, so take this only for what it's worth. But it seems to me that the reason why so many marriages fail in our society around us is precisely because so many people, even Christians, aren't looking at it as a martyrdom. They're not looking at it as a way to sacrifice ourselves for that other person's salvation, for that other person's well-being, to bring that other person and our family to God. Instead, they're looking at it as a source of nice feelings, or a source of personal fulfillment, or, whatever it is. And so when those personal feelings go away, that sense of fulfillment goes away, and we feel, well, why should I even be married anymore? What's it doing for me? Because we don't look at that marriage fundamentally as an act of sacrifice, of loving self-sacrifice. We look at it as what am I getting out of it? This can happen with monasticism too. You can think, oh, I'm going to go there and I'm going to be filled with these lofty spiritual feelings and visions and consolations and all of these things. And then when that doesn't happen, we feel like, well, it's not working, because it's all about, what do I feel? What do I like? How does it seem to me? And so no matter what it is that we're undertaking, and of course we all have to struggle with this because it's in all of us, it's not like we're ever going to perfectly be rid of these things, but we have to at least be trying to look at any of these vocations fundamentally as how, is this the best way in which I can express love for Christ, for the church, for the people around me? Because that self-sacrificing love is the only way to truly find joy and peace and fulfillment and all these other, because the desire in itself isn't wrong. It's natural to want to feel peace, to feel a sense of purpose and meaning and self-satisfaction. But if we pursue those feelings as an end in and of themselves, that's where we get into trouble. But ultimately those desires will find their fulfillment in a true Christian life of love and self-sacrifice and prayer and all of these things. But we have to realize that, essentially, we can't get to the resurrection except by ascending the cross. And so, again, and this is something that for monastics, it can be sort of a rude awakening when, at a certain point, those first feelings of grace and consolation that so many people have when they enter the monastery, it goes away. And instead there's dryness and drudgery, and it becomes difficult to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning every single day and stand through a long church service and then go and do something that we don't really like, to work all day, next to people who maybe we don't get along with that well, and then it feels like, okay, well, this is a failure. Something's gone wrong. I'm not a good spiritual person because I don't have these good spiritual feelings, but that's, those periods really, and this is something that our abbot reminds us of over and over again, those are the times when we really have the chance to make the most progress, to really become true monks, to really become true Christians, because we're not getting anything out of it. It can be very easy to unconsciously become spiritual hedonists, and, I'll pray basically because I like the feelings that I get when I pray. And when I don't have those feelings, I think, well, my prayer is dry and a failure, and how can this please God? When really, sometimes those prayers are the most pleasing to God. When we don't feel like it, we don't want to, but we choose to make that offering of love to Him anyway. That can be extremely pleasing to Him. And like I said, it can really be an opportunity to grow tremendously as Christians, no matter what state of life that we're in. But as long as we have our focus all on ourselves, and what our own feelings are, what our thoughts are, what our own condition is, we're going to get way off track. It's like the priest who baptized me. He said it's the Christian life is kind of like driving. If you're driving along and your eyes are on the horizon, it's very easy to go straight along the road. Because you have your eyes on the goal. But if you look, right down in front of you at the road, and you're constantly going to be trying to swerve back and forth to stay in the lines and avoid this and avoid that, if everything's just right in front of you, you're not going to be able to go, smoothly and straight, towards the destination that you've chosen. So if we get so focused, on just how I feel right at this second, we're going to overcorrect this way and that way and all sorts of things. So again, this is another reason why spiritual fathers are so important, because they'll be able to say very easily that that's what we're doing. And they'll be able to say, no, the fact that your prayer is dry, that's fine. Just pray anyway, and God will accept that offering, and we can be reassured, but if we have to evaluate our own spiritual life, we'll get all sorts of wrong signals and misinterpret things. And, because we'll just ultimately be wrapped up in ourselves, that communion with God will be severed, which is the goal of all of it. All of our prayer, fasting, asceticism, church services, all of that. The point is to be with God, So anyway, I've now gone off on quite a tangent. I apologize.
That's all right. That's all right. So that's very good practical advice. I think for people like me who overthink, sometimes we can be like, okay, this might be my will, or this. How do we know if this is my will, or this is God's will, or if this is what I think God wants me to do? How can we be sure that our will is in alignment with God's will when it comes to these things?
Well, for a monk, it's easy. We practice obedience. And so if our abbot, our spiritual father, tells us to do something, tells us this is the kind of spiritual discipline that you should be practicing, this one isn't, then we can be perfectly at peace, because even if he's wrong, objectively speaking, even if, for example, he tells us to do the work in a way that's subpar or something like that, from a spiritual point of view, it's far more important to be obedient than it is to be correct. Something that Saint Porphyrios, one of the recent saints from Greece, he said, "I'd much rather be wrong in the church than right outside of the church," which is sort of a macrocosm, but on a practical level too at the monastery, learning to not worry about whether I'm right or I'm wrong, but simply to be obedient for the sake of the love of Christ makes our lives so peaceful and so calm, because we can be assured. We're doing this for the sake of Christ. We're obeying the person that God has put over me. And that's all I need to worry about. I'm not responsible for making sure the entire world is being run in the best possible way, and so there's tremendous peace in that. It can, this practice of obedience is something that for many of us, especially as Americans, can seem oppressive at the beginning. But I can tell you from my own experience that it's in fact tremendously freeing, because we're freed from the tyranny of whatever our own preference or opinion might happen to be about every little thing. And it's such a blessed relief to not have to decide every single thing for ourselves. But anyway, so for a monk, it's relatively easy to know what God's will is, because we have holy obedience. But for a lay person, obviously, that's not practiced to the same extent. I will say your first line of recourse, once again, should always be to ask your spiritual father's advice. He's not going to give you an obedience in the same way that a monastic superior is going to. But still, to bounce off, whatever you're thinking about, with your spiritual guide is going to be a tremendous help and blessing, because again, we can get in our own, like you said, in our own heads so easily. And get caught up in all these things that someone with an outside perspective, who's also a spiritual person, this will be able to enlighten many things that, before we spoke it out loud, seem like almost insoluble problems or something like that. The other thing that I would say, just as, by way of general advice about this, I would say, again, don't be so caught up in abstractions as much as possible. Look at what's practically possible. Look at the doors that Providence is opening in your life and the ones that Providence is closing in your life. If you really feel an intense desire to get married and you've done everything that you can for 20 years and it's just not happening, this is perhaps a sign that God is calling you to something different. Maybe not, it's not that you're usually going to get some, writing on the wall like Nebuchadnezzar, to tell you exactly what God's will is, but to simply observe the circumstances that Providence has arranged in your life is extremely important. And it can solve many things that seem like completely intractable problems when it just exists in our own head. Like Christ said, fundamentally, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. What was he talking about? He said, don't worry about what to eat or what to drink, what to be clothed with. You could say, by extension, what career path to go down. I mean, yes, we have to make decisions. It's not like you just sit back and do nothing. But I would say most importantly, make the decisions in front of you that day. Even this moment, do right now what makes the most sense. And, of course, you will get to certain junctures in life when you have to make some significant decisions, but you don't have to make those decisions until you get to those junctures, And I think a lot of times we can create, tremendous pressure on ourselves to decide all these things in advance that really these decisions aren't for right now. Our job is to, prepare for these things insofar as is reasonable today. but simply being grounded in the present moment rather than in what ultimately, unfortunately, a lot of times is simply our fantasies about the future. Just living in the real world, is going to give God the opportunity to speak to you in a way that he's not going to be able to speak to us when we're just wrapped up in our own thoughts and fantasies and projections and, all sorts of things like that.
As a follow-up to that, because you mentioned kind of the example in the monastic context, you just do what the abbot tells you, basically. You don't really have to think too much about it. But for lay people, we have spiritual fathers, but we don't follow spiritual fathers 100% in the way that like a monastic would follow
Right.
the abbot. So how do we draw the line between, for lay people and that are not monastics, how do we draw the line and discern like when this is our maybe our spiritual father's best advice, which is good, and maybe when we should deviate from that? Not that we should be seeking to deviate from that, but how do we discern like where to draw that line of obedience?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll say from the beginning, even for a monastic, there are times when you need to disobey your superior. Much more rarely, of course, but in cases, of heresy or schism or gross immorality or something like that, which of course usually doesn't happen. Unfortunately, from time to time, it might happen. But it's not like we're just supposed to, as monks, turn off, our brains and our souls and just become robots or something like that. I mean, obedience isn't about crushing, our own selves and just becoming a slave of something else. It's really obedience in its true sense brings out our true identities. It allows, the new man to flourish, unencumbered by the old man and all of our passions and all of our, the sinful accumulations that have enslaved our will. I mean, really, obedience is about getting rid of all of this enslavement to the fallen self, so that the true new creation in Christ will be able to live. That's the goal of a real spiritual father, not to just somehow order people around all of the day. But as far as, so along those lines, as far as the relationships between spiritual fathers and lay people go, in my opinion, a good spiritual father will give very few like absolute obediences to their spiritual children. I mean, obviously, it's their job to expound the faith to them. We don't have the right as Orthodox Christians to just decide whether or not we're going to believe, the church's doctrines about this or that or the other thing, as though it was like just a cafeteria style Protestantism or something like that. So when our spiritual father is telling us, this is an absolute teaching of the church, then obviously this calls us to obedience to it. This can apply to theological things, but also, to issues of morality and ethics and things like that. Not to say that there aren't, more gray issues or areas that are hard to discern within that, but there are certain things that simply, our spiritual father is going to tell us this isn't permitted for an Orthodox Christian to do, and we need to obey that. But if someone, if a layperson has a spiritual father who's telling them, you shouldn't buy a car unless I give you a blessing to do it or something like that, this is really, starting to become, almost kind of, maybe not outright spiritual abuse yet, but you're kind of going in that direction and could easily, fall into that territory for real. So I would hope that for most people, your question simply won't be an issue, that it'll be clear when the priest is speaking to them as the voice of the church. And it'll be clear when he's saying, this is my advice as someone who knows you and cares about you and loves you, but ultimately it's up to you. And if we're not sure, we can always ask. We're saying like, Father, are you giving me an obedience, or are you, giving me, your advice? And of course, even his advice is going to be important. We should take it seriously. But I would say, just as for a monk, in matters of morality or the faith, we should disobey when we've been told something contrary to the church. Similarly, I would say probably for lay people, those are, I don't want to put my foot in it because I haven't really thought this through very much, but my instinct would be to say that like outside of those matters of like strictly expounding the teachings of the church, there probably are going to be few situations where you're absolutely bound as a matter of obedience as a layperson to do what your spiritual father tells you to do.
I think asking the question is good. Is this an obedience or not? Because it may not be clear.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I mean, I've so rarely heard of any priest, who's giving. I mean, even something as involved in church life is, for example, whether a layperson is going to go to seminary and try to become a priest. Of course, you need a blessing to do that. But I mean, I've never heard of someone who was given an obedience to do that, who was told you have to do that.
Right. I think a lot of
freedom is so important in the Christian life.
A lot of people do kind of confuse when they're getting advice versus when they're getting an obedience. So,
yeah. So I mean, I think that really when we're talking about our spiritual disciplines, the way that we're practicing our spiritual lives, this is the area where, of course, obedience does have its place. But even then, as I said before, real obedience isn't just about one person controlling another person. It exists in a context of trust and of love, and of mutual communication and openness. I mean, even with something like a prayer rule, a prayer rule is something that ultimately should come from our spiritual father, not be decided by ourselves. But we need to tell our spiritual father how it's going. If it's something that's just too much for us, or if we feel like, we're not growing, I mean, we talk to them about it and they take what we say into consideration. That doesn't mean that they just let us do whatever we happen to feel like, but they'll take it into consideration. And through a process of honesty and dialogue, and discernment, we'll come to something that will be spiritually productive for us. So, I mean, I guess ultimately, like, I can't give any rule about, right, you have to obey in this case and you should never obey in any other case. I mean, I would say, the most important thing in all of this is to have your spiritual father be someone that you trust, right? Because real obedience necessitates trust, and just to give your blind obedience to someone who you don't trust is a recipe for disaster. So find a spiritual father who, and again, for most people, it's going to be their parish priest, and that's fine and wonderful, because most parish priests that I've known are wonderful people. But what it comes down to is do you trust this person to tell you how to find Christ or not? If you trust them, then, usually you'll take the advice that they give, and they usually aren't going to try to strong arm you into something that's, totally superfluous to your salvation. I don't know if I've really, answered this well or talked about what you wanted me to talk about. I mean, that
helps. That helps for sure.
I guess just to close, I would say, like, if you're concerned that you've been given an obedience that's not reasonable, and it's a serious thing, talk to the bishop about it. I mean, we have bishops for a reason. Unfortunately, in America, we can sometimes get the feeling that they're just totally aloof, or something like that, and not part of our actual lives. But it's important to remember that, no priest has the authority to perform any of the mysteries on his own power. We're always acting as the hands of the bishop with his explicit, blessing and authorization. We're the agents of the bishop, basically. We don't have that, power in and of ourselves. To celebrate the liturgy, for example, or to hear confessions. We're always acting for the bishop. So if you feel like your priest is not behaving towards you properly, you have recourse. You have recourse to the mechanisms that the church gives to make sure that something unhealthy hasn't developed.
Right. So I think outside of the marriage monasticism question, there are other vocations that one could do. And one of the bigger callings is the priesthood. Mm-hmm. So how do you, what advice would you have to give? How could you tell if someone you think is maybe called to the priesthood?
Well, in many cases, the call will come from the church. Not necessarily in every case, but very often, what will happen is that the person's, priest will take them aside and say, have you ever thought about, serving the church in this capacity or something like that, And so if that initial call comes from the church, then I think already that's something to take very seriously, to give very, wholehearted consideration to. If it's something that comes from our own desires, that's not necessarily like a sign that it's immediately wrong, but it is something that I would advise to be treated, with more suspicion, because people can often have the idea that the priesthood is something different than what it really is, or that it's going to be a source of personal power or glory or authority or something like that. Even if we're not conscious of that, that desire can be within us. The passion of pride and ambition is something that everyone has to some extent or another. And so any kind of gravitation towards a position that we feel rightly or wrongly might satisfy that desire is something to be cautious about. So I would say, ask carefully, why is it that I'm thinking about the priesthood? Is it because, I love the church so much and I want to spend every moment that I can in the divine services, and I'm trying to go out of my way each day to find ways to help people come to Christ, and in whatever way makes sense for me in the context of my current life. If it's an expression out of piety and faith and prayer and love for God, then I think it's something to take to your spiritual father and say, I have this desire. What do you think? And talk about it. If when we're being honest with ourselves, we instead find that it's more that we like the idea of ourselves as a certain kind of spiritual person, or having a certain kind of position within the church, then, be much more cautious about it. If it's persistent, it never hurts to ask your spiritual father. But be honest with him also that, hey, I'm worried maybe this is, because of some pride within me or something like that. And again, he'll be able to help you work through all that and find out another thing that I would say is if you go into it, with a palpable sense that you're going to be sacrificing something, then again, that's a much more trustworthy sort of mindset to be going into it with, because ultimately that's the case. I remember after the bishop and abbot here said that he wanted me to be ordained, I spoke later about it with the priest who baptized me, and he said, just remember one thing: the only thing that the church has to offer you in the priesthood is the cross, but through the cross joy has come to all the world. And I found that to be absolutely true. The priesthood absolutely is a cross. And if we go into it with the idea that it's something else, we're going to have a very hard time at minimum, if not, possibly do a lot of damage to ourselves and even to others, God forbid. So again, if this decision is being approached like every other decision from the context of, how can I, first of all, become united with Christ, but, also therefore live out a life of sacrificial love for the people around me. If that's the basis for it, then if it's God's will, he'll open the doors and it'll happen. That's another thing that I would say. It's like, if this is something that we really, are having to push, be wary of it. If you're like hounding people about, trying to get into a seminary and they're kind of dragging their feet or something like that, well, then maybe just back off, at least for a time. When we, which is not the same thing as it's going to be hard work to do it. You know what I mean? Like, of course, it's going to involve a lot of hard work. I'm not saying like if you have to make any effort towards it, then don't do it. Like, that's certainly not it. But if you really have the feeling that you're trying to impose your will to become a priest, that's very dangerous. So again, the most important thing is to be, open and to discuss all these things with your spiritual father, not just, the thing itself, but also what are my thoughts and feelings about it, the good and the bad. Be completely open about it so that they can give you the best advice possible. But if it's something that God is calling us to, the doors will open, and if it's not, then look for something else that the doors are open to, I would say.
Right. So as far as other potential vocations, there's iconographer, podicellity, choir director, catechist, etc. what are some indicators that someone might be called to one of those roles, as opposed to marriage, monasticism, priesthood, and additionally, just kind of as a practical question, what would the next steps look like for someone wanting to pursue one of those roles?
So I'm not sure that I caught all the things that you mentioned. It seems to me that most of them are sort of supplemental vocations that can take place in the context either of monasticism or marriage, or whatever else sort of the main life path that we take is.
Right.
And a lot of them, I think, frankly, have to do with the talents and skills that God has given to us. If we have a good voice, it's probably a good idea to ask our priest, or whoever's in charge of the choir at our parish, hey, I have some experience singing. Could the choir use some help? Similarly with, really any other need. So again, I think, these decisions shouldn't necessarily be made in the abstract so much as they should be made based on looking at what does my parish need? If it's obvious that they're having trouble getting people to read the Psalms, then you maybe volunteer yourself to read the Psalter. If it's clear that the choir has trouble getting people to sing, if it seems like, the church is always dirty, maybe volunteer to help the church warden or to become the church warden. Look for what real needs exist in the church, and if these match up with your either intrinsic abilities or the time that you have available, whatever it is, then ask the priest if he would like you to do that. And if it requires training, if it requires further study, they'll let you know for sure how to go about acquiring that. And this is something it's going to be different in different churches and jurisdictions and things. Some have music schools that they can send you to really learn how to put the services together well, different things like that. But all of that, again, God will open these doors for you if this is something that you need. Again, I would say, talk to your spiritual father, look at the real world. Our enemy in everything is really being in our own head in the spiritual life, making decisions that are not connected with reality, that are not connected with the advice of our spiritual father or other people who are whose lives we want to emulate, basically. One of the oldest sayings in Christian monasticism is the person who has himself for a spiritual father has a fool for a spiritual father. That really, even if the decision that you make is quote unquote right, still nothing good is going to come of it, because it's something that is existing apart from a lived relationship with God. Like, again, that's the root of all of these things. Like what is proceeding from our real, actual connection with Christ and his church, and what is just our own desires or our own opinions or our own instincts about what our lives or the spiritual life are supposed to be like somehow. Being rooted in reality. Like, I mean, I don't know if this is something that's because our society has become so dependent on the internet and technology, and so much of our lives have become mediated in these sort of virtual or fake ways of living. And, of course, some of us are going to be more inclined towards this temptation than others, but it's so easy for us to be living basically in a mental, copy of real life. And those copies can be quite good and quite sophisticated and really, trick us into thinking that we are living in the real world. But we're really, sort of observers of our own life rather than living the actual life that God has given to us on a day-to-day basis. So I think just being present and aware, and looking for God's providence, because it's something that we're not going to, just be probably driving down the road and then all of a sudden, we're going to be hit on the head with what God's providence is calling us to do. We have to be looking for it. We have to be asking ourselves, whenever anything happens in our life, what is God trying to give me through this? What is he trying to teach me through this? Pray about these things, talk to your spiritual father about these things. We have to really be actively looking for God's providence, God's hand. And of course, this isn't to say that we're always going to have the answers to those questions. I mean, probably most of the time we won't be able to answer the question, but we should be asking these questions. We should be looking for God's providence, even though most of the time, we're not going to be able to understand it till maybe years, decades, maybe even after our earthly lives are over. We're not going to be able to fully understand these things until then, if at all. But if we don't even get into the habit of looking for God's hand, in the world and in our lives, then we're just going to be wrapped up in something else entirely, more likely than not.
Mm-hmm. So one question that came to mind as you were talking is kind of the inverse of all the questions that I've been asking is, how do we know if we're running away from the will of God?
Mm. Well, that's a much harder question to answer, I think.
I think if I can predict what you might say,
sure.
It's kind of go through the open door is essentially kind of go through the open door and follow what your priest is advising you.
There's an extent.
I don't want to put words in your mouth. Go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, you were quoting things that I've said over and over, so no risk of that. But certainly, I think that's a part of it. But there's also a sense in which if things are too open or too easy, that's also a warning sign. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you a story that really struck me and has stayed with me and has seemed relevant to many situations since then. Maybe you already know it. It's a story about St. Ambrose of Milan. He was of course, a bishop of the early church, same time as St. Augustine, but he was traveling through the countryside around Milan with his deacon. And as they were traveling, they passed the estate of a landowner who saw the bishop and invited him to come in and dine with him. And so they said, "Okay, well, thank you very much." And they stopped in to have a meal with this landowner. And as they were waiting for the meal to be ready, St. Ambrose was talking to the landowner and asked, how are things going? How has your life been? He said, "Oh, glory be to God. Everything is wonderful. God has blessed me very richly." And he said, "Well, how are your children doing?" He said, "Oh, thank God, they're wonderful children. They've grown up in the fear of God. They have their own families. It's very beautiful. So how about your farm, your estate?" And he said, "Thank God they're prospering. The harvest is coming in richly. He's given me, everything that I need." This goes on for a little while. And finally, St. Ambrose turns to his deacon and says, "We have to depart. We can't eat here because God does not dwell in this house." Which is, of course, really an astonishing thing to hear. And I think we need to maybe think about that a little bit. It seems to me that the reason that he said that was the only reason why a loving God allows suffering in our life, or hardship or difficulty, or the cross in whatever form it is in our life, is because it is through these things that we can grow, deepen in our faith, be healed of what ails us spiritually, become more like Him, become capable of real love, to become capable of being who we were created to be, who we really want to be in our deepest hearts. It's really only through sufferings and difficulties that our passions can be stripped away, that we can learn to turn away from the very things that are causing us these pains to begin with, our passions, our sins, our mistakes. But if God sees that we're so stubborn, and we're so set in our ways that no suffering will do us that good, that we'll reject that lesson, we'll reject that gift, then God's not going to just torture us meaninglessly. If this suffering won't be able to benefit us and heal our souls, He's not going to just punish us with this for no reason. And so what St. Ambrose was saying was that ultimately, even though it looked externally like everything was going well for this man, that ultimately he had so hardened himself to God's providence, to God's love, that because hardship and difficulty wouldn't have done him any good, that simply God left him alone. God left him alone. And so, if we've acquired what seems to us like peace, and that, we're going through all of the open doors and everything's calm, but we haven't really repented deeply. We haven't really learned to live a life of sincere prayer and of profound love and self-sacrifice. That, to me, is one of the biggest warning signs that we're not listening to God's voice, that we are closing ourselves off to the gifts and the lessons and the opportunities for healing and salvation that God wants to give to us. Not always. I mean, so basically what I'm saying is, like, and I forget which saint or Holy Father said it, but they, many of them said things, along these lines, but one said something to the effect of, basically beware of any kind of peace that you think you have before you've been crucified. Because peace absolutely is one of the most profound goals of the Christian life. And it is what, it's a gift that God wants to give to us, but it's a gift that we can't obtain in its truth until the old man is dead. And so if we feel like we have it, but the old man is also still alive, then really it basically means that the old man is just getting his way, so that would probably be the main thing that I would say as far as closing ourselves off to God's will is that that famous book from the 20th century, like why do bad things happen to good people or something like that. It's like the question of the inverse of why do good things happen to bad people,
right?
Like really this is the answer. It's because they have no interest in God, they have no interest in loving the people around them, and they have so little interest in these things that again, if God were to allow them the same difficulties and sufferings that we experience in our lives as Christians, it would just be torturing them. It would do them no good, and God's not like that. So if our lives are too easy, if things are going too well, we should maybe step back and ask ourselves, well, why is this? Because there's only two answers. There's one that we've become so humble and obedient and submissive to God's will and have so much faith in His love that we're capable of accepting everything that happens to us, no matter how difficult and painful, with perfect peace, or God's left us alone. Those are the choices. Right. So,
yeah, it can definitely be difficult discerning that, because on one hand, the prosperity gospel is something that is just kind of implicit in our culture, that if good things happen, then that means God's blessing you, and that a good thing is good. But the Orthodox take is sometimes not always. That's not always the case. And
that's a really good point. Like I should just real quick jump on what you just said to make it clear that I'm not being some kind of absolutist, that the Christian life is supposed to be like all suffering and misery all the time, or something like that. There's always going to be a mix of blessings and consolations, because God gives us what we need, at any given time. And sometimes we need consolation, sometimes we need peace, sometimes we need comfort and to experience the love of others, for example. Sometimes we need the opposite. So it's not that we need to just be torturing ourselves or to be hoping that our lives are constantly miserable or anything like that. It's when we go to either extreme, like that's when we know something's wrong. If our lives are all pleasure all the time, something's wrong. If it's all suffering and misery all the time, something is also wrong. It means that we're really not looking at these things the way that we should, or that we're torturing ourselves out of some misguided sense that God just wants pain for its own sake or something. So anyway, sorry, keep going with what you were saying.
No, that was actually pretty much just where I was going anyway, because it's not that blessings are bad, but it's not that blessings are always necessarily a good thing, but also things that come up in life that are difficult, sometimes that's for the better. And so, as with a lot of things in Orthodoxy, you kind of have to find the balance. You have to find the middle path, the royal path.
Absolutely.
So, well, this has been really good. I think there's been a lot of really good practical advice that you've given for people. Just as we wrap up here, what kind of parting advice do you have for those seeking to discern their place in the church?
I would just reiterate, what I said at the beginning, that no matter what it is that God is calling us to, and at whatever point in our lives He will choose to make that clear, the best thing that we can be doing now to prepare for it is simply to become, the best Christians that we can be at this moment in time, and that, that's expressed through prayer, through going to church, through reading spiritual books, but, just as importantly, if not more importantly, loving the people around us, forgiving the people around us, learning to show mercy and to overlook the faults of people around us. And I think this is really, much harder than many other things in the Christian. I mean, you can look, for example, some people, these Orthodox, they fast all the time, it's like, how can, but, you look around, how many people are vegetarians or vegans, for some other reason, either because they care about animal rights or for some diet reason or something like that. Like, people eat much more strictly than Orthodox do. You can look at other religious traditions who, as Saint Isaac the Syrian said, can oftentimes put us to shame as Orthodox Christians in many ways by the intensity of their efforts. Ultimately, none of the things that we do externally in our Christian lives will profit us anything, like St. Paul says, if we don't have love. And ultimately, all of these outward efforts are much, much easier than acquiring real love, real mercy, real forgiveness. To love your enemies, like that is the mark of a Christian. Regardless of how long your prayer roll is, or how strictly you fast, or how many hours a day you spend in church, or how many books of theology you've read. To be able to love your enemies, like that's what Christ said. By this shall all men know that you're my disciples, by the love you have one for another. And of course, also for the love that we have for those who hate us and wrong us and persecute us. And really, even if we're complete failures in all other ways in our Christian life, if at least we can forgive the people who've wronged us, then God tells us we have nothing to worry about. He says, everything will be forgiven to you. If you show mercy, mercy will be shown to you. Like this is the shortcut to sanctification, because again, this is who God is. He's merciful. He makes his sun to shine on the good and the evil, the just and the unjust, the grateful and the ungrateful. And so the most important thing for us as Christians at any point in our spiritual life, but especially at the beginning, to lay this as the foundation, is really, what did Christ say to the Pharisees? Go learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. I think if we hold that in mind and we pursue that with all of our heart, then with God's help, we'll be able to avoid a lot of the pitfalls that young converts can oftentimes fall into, that I myself fell into, to become fixated on outward forms or theology or whatever. I mean, because it's this whole new world of beautiful, wonderful things that are open to us, and of course, all these things are good and wonderful, of course, in themselves. But if we forget that ultimately all these things are only means to the end of acquiring the love of Christ, of being united with Christ in his self-sacrificing love, then the demons will be able to distract us and trick us and, make us think that we're living an exalted spiritual life when really we're living, basically just because we like the idea of ourself as a spiritual person. But there's really, there can be a counterfeit for many things in the spiritual life. But I don't think there can really be a counterfeit for love and forgiveness for our enemies, especially. So if we put this in the first place, then it's the warning and the promise that the Apostle John gave in his epistle. If how can you see God, or how can you love God who you haven't seen if you don't love your brother who you have seen? The converse of that is, if we learn to love our brothers, we'll be able to see God, we'll be able to love God, we'll be able to know God. And that's what the Christian life is all about. That's what the Orthodox life is all about, whether, priest or lay, whether married or monastic, whatever it is, it's ultimately with that goal in mind. And if we keep that goal in mind and struggle towards it with all our hearts, then all of these, more external decisions, outward decisions, I think for the most part, with God's grace and with the advice of our spiritual father, all these things will fall into place.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I think just as before I conclude here, I'll remind anyone listening that if they want to go visit Holy Cross Monastery, I'll have a link to your website. And also, if they want to donate to help the building of the new church or any other kind of projects that you guys have going on, that they can do that, because that's important, because you guys can't get by without it. So
thank you so much. And I apologize for my tendency to ramble. It's not very monastic of me, so I appreciate you being patient with me.
No worries. I mean, you had a lot of good advice to give for people, and I think it's important for people to hear what you had to say. So I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you very much.